It was a warm, sunny afternoon in the busy streets of the city. Cars honked, people chatted, and the smell of food filled the air. Emily Ward walked slowly but surely, holding onto the leash of her guide dog, Max. Her steps were steady, and her face was calm. She wore dark sunglasses, and her cane tapped lightly against the sidewalk. To everyone around, Emily looked like just another blind woman, moving through life with quiet strength. People passed by her without a second thought. They thought she was helpless. They thought she needed help all the time. But they were wrong. Because Emily had a secret. And Max? Well, Max wasn't just an ordinary dog. Max was special. His sharp eyes watched everything, his ears caught every tiny sound, and his muscles were always ready. Most people thought he was just a kind and loyal guide dog. But they didn't know the truth. Max was more than that, much more. As Emily and Max walked down the crowded sidewalk, they passed by a group of men standing near their motorcycles. The men wore black leather jackets, heavy boots, and dark sunglasses. They looked tough. They looked mean. Their bikes were big and loud, lined up in a neat row by the side of the road. The men leaned against them, laughing and talking loudly. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard, nudged his friend and pointed at Emily. He grinned and said, "Look at her. Poor lady doesn't even see what's coming her way." The others laughed. They thought it was funny. They thought Emily couldn't hear them. They thought she was weak. But Emily heard them. Oh yes, she did. She didn't need to see to understand what was happening. She knew their type, the kind of people who thought they were better than everyone else, the kind who liked to pick on people they thought were weak. Emily paused for just a second. Her lips curled into a small smile, so small that no one noticed. It was a smile that only Max could understand. Max's ears twitched, and his body stiffened just a little. His eyes stayed focused ahead, but he knew something was coming. He was trained for moments like this. His tail stayed still, his breathing slowed, and his paws lightly touched the ground. Emily took a deep breath and kept walking. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just walked, and Max walked beside her. The bikers kept watching. They smirked and whispered to each other. They thought they were clever. One of them, a younger man with a red bandana tied around his head, took a step forward. "Hey, lady," he called out. "Need some help?" His voice was full of fake kindness. His friends laughed again. Emily kept walking as if she didn't hear him. She gripped Max's leash a little tighter, feeling the warmth of his strong body next to her. Max didn't react, but Emily could feel the tension in his muscles. He was ready. The younger biker walked closer, stepping right in front of her. "I said, do you need help?" he repeated, louder this time. Emily stopped. She turned her head slightly toward him, her face still calm. "No, thank you," she said softly. The biker laughed. "Come on, lady. Let me give you a hand." He reached out, trying to touch her arm. Before his fingers could get close, Max let out a low, deep growl. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. The biker froze, pulling his hand back quickly. His friends saw what happened and their laughter faded. "Whoa," the biker said, stepping back. "Easy, dog. No need to bite." Emily smiled again, this time a little wider. "Max doesn't bite," she said. "Unless he has to." The other bikers looked at each other. They didn't know what to say. They weren't used to people standing up to them, especially not someone like Emily. The older biker with the thick beard crossed his arms and stared at Max. "What's so special about that dog, huh? Looks like a regular mutt to me." Emily tilted her head, pretending to think. "Oh, he's just a normal guide dog," she said lightly. "He helps me get around." Max's ears twitched again. Emily knew the truth. Max wasn't just helping her walk. He was helping her stay safe. The bearded man laughed and shook his head. "Yeah, right," he muttered. "Come on, let's go." The bikers walked away, but they kept glancing back at Emily and Max. They didn't know why, but something about that dog made them uneasy. Something about the way Emily stood there so calmly made them feel like they were the ones being watched, not the other way around. Emily took another deep breath and gave Max a small pat on the head. "Good boy," she whispered. Max wagged his tail slightly and guided her forward once more. The crowd of people moved aside as they walked, and soon the bikers were nothing more than a memory. But Emily knew this wasn't over. She could still hear the sound of their laughter echoing in her mind. She knew they might not leave her alone so easily. And that was okay. Because she wasn't afraid. And neither was Max. As they continued walking, Emily thought about the people around her. They all thought she was just an ordinary blind woman. But they had no idea who she really was. They didn't know that Emily was part of something bigger. They didn't know that Max was trained for more than just guiding her through the streets. They didn't know that Max had skills most people couldn't even imagine. But they would find out. One day, Emily and Max turned a corner, leaving the busy street behind them. The city was full of noise and life, but they moved through it with quiet confidence. Emily didn't need to see to know where she was going. Because with Max by her side, she could go anywhere. And as for the bikers, well, they didn't know it yet, but they had just met their match. Max's ears flicked one more time, listening closely to the world around them. Emily smiled, knowing that whatever happened next, they were ready. Because Max wasn't just any dog. And Emily, she wasn't just any blind woman. Emily walked down the sidewalk, holding Max's leash firmly. She moved with confidence, her cane tapping lightly against the ground. The city was busy, full of noise and movement. People hurried past her, cars honked, and music played from nearby shops. But Emily wasn't thinking about the crowd or the noise. She could feel something was wrong. And Max could feel it too. His ears twitched, and his body tensed just a little. Ahead, a group of bikers stood near their shiny motorcycles. They wore black leather jackets, boots, and dark sunglasses. They looked rough and tough, like they owned the street. Their loud laughter filled the air as they watched Emily walking closer. One of them, a tall man with a deep, rough voice, stepped forward and blocked her path. His name was Vince. He was the leader of the group, and he liked being in charge. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made people feel uncomfortable. "Hey there, miss," Vince said, tilting his head. His voice sounded fake, like he was pretending to be nice but really wasn't. "You lost or something?" The other bikers laughed. They thought it was funny to tease her. Emily stopped walking. She stood still for a moment, then tilted her head slightly, listening carefully. Her face was calm, and she didn't look worried at all. "No, I'm not lost," she said softly. "But maybe you're about to be." The bikers stopped laughing for a second. They looked at each other, confused. Did she just make a joke? Or did she not understand the situation? Vince's smile disappeared, and he folded his arms across his chest. Vince chuckled, trying to act tough. He took a step closer and looked down at Max. Max stood tall, his golden fur shining in the sunlight. His eyes were sharp, watching Vince closely. Vince tapped Max lightly with the toe of his boot. "What's this?" he said with a smirk. "A fancy mud to do your thinking for you." Before anyone could blink, Max let out a low, deep growl. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make Vince take a small step back. The sound was serious, and it made the air feel colder. The other bikers stopped laughing. They glanced at Max, then at each other. They weren't sure if they should still be joking. Something about this dog didn't feel right. Vince, trying to stay tough, crossed his arms and rolled his eyes. "What's your dog gonna do, huh? Lead you to safety?" he sneered. Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply adjusted her grip on Max's leash and took a small step forward. Her face was calm and peaceful, but Max was focused and still. It was like the world around them had suddenly gone quiet. Max's tail was still, his eyes locked on Vince, and his body ready. He didn't growl anymore. He didn't bark. He just waited. Vince didn't like it. He could feel the change in the air. The bikers behind him were shifting nervously, their confidence fading just a little. One of them whispered, "Hey, man, maybe we should leave her alone." Vince shot him a glare. "Shut up," he snapped. He didn't like being told what to do, especially in front of his friends. He had to prove he was the boss. Emily could hear everything: the nervousness in their voices, the shuffling of their feet, the way the mood was changing. But she stayed quiet. She knew Max was ready. Vince took another step forward and reached out his hand. "Come on, lady," he said, trying to sound friendly again. "I'm just trying to help." Before he could get any closer, Max moved. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He just shifted his weight slightly, standing between Emily and Vince. It was a small move, but it spoke louder than words. Vince stopped, staring at the dog. He could see it now: Max wasn't just any dog. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't backing down. Emily spoke again, her voice still soft but firm. "I don't need your help," she said. "And I think you should move." Vince hesitated. He didn't like this feeling. He was used to people being scared of him. But Emily wasn't scared. And Max? Max was something else. The other bikers were getting restless. "Come on, Vince," one of them said. "Let's go." "She's not worth it." Vince glared at Emily one more time, trying to scare her. But Emily just stood there, waiting. Max didn't move an inch. Finally, Vince stepped back and raised his hands. "Fine, whatever," he said, trying to act like he didn't care. "Have it your way, lady." Emily smiled gently. "I always do," she said. Vince turned and walked back to his motorcycle, but his face was red with anger. He didn't like losing. The other bikers followed him, looking back at Emily and Max with nervous glances. As they got on their bikes and roared off down the street, Emily finally relaxed. She let out a quiet breath and reached down to pat Max's head. "Good boy," she whispered. Max wagged his tail once, but he kept his eyes on the road. He knew this wasn't over. And so did Emily. The people around them started moving again, as if nothing had happened. Emily continued walking, Max guiding her through the busy streets. She knew there would always be people like Vince, people who thought they could push others around. But she also knew that with Max by her side, she would always be ready. Because Max wasn't just a guide dog. He was her protector. And anyone who tried to mess with her would learn that the hard way. Emily stood quietly, holding Max's leash. The air around her felt heavy. The bikers were not leaving. Instead, they moved closer. One by one, they stepped forward, forming a half circle around her. Their leather jackets creaked as they shifted, and their boots scraped against the pavement. Vince, the leader, smirked. His voice was louder now, full of teasing and challenge. "Come on, lady. What's the matter? Scared?" he said with a chuckle. Emily stayed calm. She didn't move. She didn't frown. She didn't even look scared. She simply stood there, listening. Vince took another step closer. "You should watch where you're going," he sneered. "Oh wait, you can't." The other bikers laughed. One of them muttered, "Yeah, better hold on to that mud real tight." Max didn't react to their words. But Emily could feel the energy in him shift. His ears twitched, his stance stiffened just a little, and his tail stayed low but steady. He was ready, waiting. Emily slowly reached into the pocket of her coat. Her fingers wrapped around a small metal whistle, cool and smooth. It looked like an ordinary whistle, the kind used by coaches or kids at play. But it wasn't just any whistle. Without a word, she brought it to her lips and blew gently. The sound was so soft that most people wouldn't even hear it. The bikers didn't notice. They kept laughing, thinking Emily was doing something silly. But Max noticed. In an instant, his whole body changed. His muscles tensed, and his ears stood up sharply. His eyes locked on Vince, watching his every move. Max was no longer just a calm guide dog, he was something more. Something trained. Vince blinked, confused for a moment. "Cute trick," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He took another step closer. but it's not gonna. Before he could finish his sentence, Max sprang into action. It happened so fast that no one saw it coming. In the blink of an eye, Max lunged forward, not in a wild, uncontrolled way, but with perfect, precise movements. His front paws pushed off the ground, and in one swift motion, he hit Vince's hand with incredible force. Vince yelled in surprise, stumbling back. Something shiny fell to the ground with a clatter. It was a knife. A small, sharp blade that he had hidden in his jacket. The other bikers froze, their eyes wide with shock. They hadn't expected this. Not from a dog. What the one of them stammered, stepping back. Vince looked at his empty hand, breathing hard. What? How did he? Muttered in disbelief. Emily didn't flinch. She stood still, as if she had been expecting this all along. She reached down and patted Max gently on the head. Good boy, she said softly. Max sat back, his eyes never leaving the bikers. His body was tense, ready for whatever might happen next. The bikers were no longer laughing. They whispered to each other, looking nervous. Did you see that? One of them whispered. That's not a normal dog, man. Vince's face turned red with anger. He wasn't used to being embarrassed like this. He clenched his fists, stepping toward Emily again. You think you're smart, huh? He growled. This ain't over. Emily smiled just a little. I think it is, she replied calmly. One of the bikers shook his head. Come on, Vince. Let's get out of here. That dog's not right. Vince glared at Max, then back at Emily. He hated backing down, but something about the way Max watched him made him feel uneasy. Finally, he spat on the ground and waved his hand. Let's go, he muttered. The bikers slowly backed away, their eyes darting between Emily and Max. They climbed onto their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life. One by one, they sped off down the street, leaving Emily and Max standing alone. Emily waited until the noise of the bikes faded away before she relaxed. She reached down and scratched behind Max's ears. You did great, she whispered. Max wagged his tail slightly but kept his eyes on the road. He was still alert, making sure they were truly gone. A few people walking by had stopped to watch. A woman pushing a stroller stared at Emily in awe. Your dog, he's amazing, she said. Emily smiled politely. He's special, she replied. The woman nodded and walked away, shaking her head in disbelief. Emily sighed and adjusted Max's leash. Let's keep going, buddy, she said, stepping forward. Max moved beside her, his steps confident and strong. As they walked away, Emily couldn't help but smile. Most people saw Max and thought he was just a guide dog. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know he had been trained for much more than leading her through the city streets. He was her protector, her guardian. And anyone who tried to mess with them would soon find out the hard way. As they crossed the street, Emily's mind was calm. She knew Vince and his gang might come back someday. She knew trouble could follow them anywhere. But she wasn't worried. Because with Max by her side, she was never alone. And she was never afraid. Vince and his gang stood frozen, their eyes wide with shock. They couldn't believe what they had just seen. Max wasn't an ordinary dog, he was something else, something they didn't understand. One of the bikers, a younger man with a scruffy beard, stumbled backward. His hands shook as he pointed at Max. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "What kind of dog is that?" Emily stood tall, holding Max's leash firmly. She faced them calmly, with no fear in her voice. She nodded slightly, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Max isn't just a guide dog," she said in a clear, steady voice. "He's a canine operative. He's trained to protect, defend, and take down threats." The bikers exchanged nervous glances. Max continued to move, his sharp eyes watching them closely. He circled them slowly, his paws barely making a sound on the pavement. He was like a shadow, quick and silent. Vince tried to shake off his fear. He frowned and clenched his fists. "A canine operative," he scoffed. "You're joking, right? He's just a dog." Emily didn't blink. She held up a hand, signaling Max to stop. Max froze in place, his body still but his eyes locked on Vince. "No," Emily said simply. "I'm not joking. And you've just made yourselves targets." The gang grew even more uneasy. They had thought Emily was weak, helpless. They had thought Max was just a regular dog. But now they knew they were wrong. Very wrong. One of the bikers whispered, "Vince, we should go. This feels wrong, man." Vince swallowed hard. He looked around at his gang. They weren't laughing anymore. Their faces were serious, their hands twitching nervously. The fun they thought they were having had turned into something dangerous. Vince tried to regain control. "Stop acting scared," he barked. "She's just bluffing." He pointed at Emily. "She's messing with us. That dog can't do anything." But before he could finish, Max took a step forward. It was a small step, but it was enough to make Vince take a step back without thinking. Max's muscles were tight, ready to move at any second. Emily reached into her coat pocket. The bikers watched closely, their breaths held. Slowly, she pulled out something small and shiny. It was a badge. A real, official badge. She held it up so they could all see. "By the way," she said, her voice firm and strong, "you're interfering with a federal investigation." The bikers' eyes widened. They stared at the badge, then at Emily, then back at Max. Vince's face turned pale. What?" he stammered, his voice no longer full of confidence. Emily took a step closer. "That's right," she said. "I work with law enforcement. Max and I are part of a special task force. And right now, you're in a lot of trouble." One of the bikers let out a nervous laugh, but it was shaky. "You mean, you're, like, a cop?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "Not exactly," she said. "But let's just say I have more authority than you think." Max let out a low growl, and the gang took another step back. The tough bikers who once looked so fearless were now sweating, their hands shaking, unsure of what to do next. Vince tried to act tough, but his voice wavered. "You think you can scare us with that little badge?" Emily smirked. "I don't need to scare you," she said. "Max already did that." Vince's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't move. He looked at his gang, then back at Emily. He was trapped, and he knew it. If he ran, he'd look weak. If he stayed, Max might take him down again. Emily tilted her head slightly. "You have two choices," she said calmly. "You can walk away now, or we can call for backup. And trust me, you don't want backup to get involved." The bikers